Good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. Can you hear me? We can. Okay, very good. So good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. I would like to welcome you to this webinar on the impact of volunteer sustainability initiatives in mining that ISD and IGF are hosting to present the key findings of a recent report published on the standards and the structured economy that you can all find in our website. Thank you, all of you, for being with us today. We have approximately over 150 participants registered to this webinar, which is an amazing turnaround. My name is Cristina Larrea, and I am the lead of the Sustainability Standards Program at ISD. And it is my real pleasure to lead this discussion with two of the authors of this report who are experts in the field of standards. Laura Turley. Hi, Laura.
Hello, Christine. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Hi.
Thank you. So Laura has been working with ISD since 2012 as an associate. She has a decade of experience in sustainable development research and advising in the areas of sustainable public procurement, green infrastructure finance, investment policy in the agriculture and mining sectors, as well as on the areas of voluntary sustainability standards, right the topic of this webinar in mining and forestry. Lara is currently pursuing a PhD at the University of Geneva in the topic of freshwater allocation in context of scarcity. We will be able to discuss with Lara later on. And also, I would like to welcome Matthew Wenban-Smith. Hi, Matthew.
Hi there.
Hi, Matthew has also been an author of this publication. He has worked in the area of voluntary sustainability standards and conformity assessments since 1994, initially with the Forest Stewardship Council to set up its accreditation program. Then he founded the independent consultancy One World Standards, completing a variety of projects in the mining, minerals, and metal sectors. He was appointed in 2017 as Executive Director of Responsible Steel. So welcome you both. Thank you for being with us today. Before we kick off our conversation with Matthew and Laura, I would like to go through the agenda. Okay. Okay. First of all, we will start with some introductory remarks about the mining sector. Then we will move to learn about voluntary sustainability initiatives in mining using the ISD CARE analysis and the findings of this analysis. We will follow to discuss the discussion about the role of public policy vis-a-vis these market-based approaches with Laura. And before moving to the questions and answer sections, I will wrap up some key takeaways of our discussion with Matthew and Laura. So I would like to share with you a housekeeping note. As you know, the questions and answer section of this webinar is going to be really important. You have the role there. So as participants, you can write your questions in the question and answer chat on the bottom of your screen. Please identify yourself with your name, and I will address the questions to Lara and Matthew as appropriate. So without further ado, let's start this webinar with Matthew and Laura and you all. So why is the mining sector relevant for sustainable development? I think we all know that mining is an economic activity essential for a large number of sectors in the economy. Minerals such as aluminium, copper, coal, and gold are relevant for transportation, construction, energy generation, even power lines, and personal electronics. So they are everywhere in most of the sectors of the economy. But it's more particularly important for the macroeconomy of many low to middle income countries that are more dependent on to this sector. For instance, you might know that different countries in Africa as well as Southeast Asia depend a lot on this sector for their economy. For instance, there are countries to which their mining accounts for more than 50% of the exports and even 20% of government revenue. like for instance in Guinea or Mauritania or other countries in Southeast Asia. So it's really important for low to middle income countries. In the report, you might be able to find some hot production exports by mineral. You will be able to identify some of these key leading countries. We also know, and that's why we are here today, that mining presents significant sustainability challenges and risk. For instance, environmental impacts due to the destruction of natural habitats and land degradation, pollution impacts in soil, air, and water contamination, occupational health impacts at the work sites due to the exposure of dangerous chemicals, dust, or noise, as well as social impacts, as there are many human displacements and resettlements due to mining activities. Just to give you some data example, metal mining alone generates 15 billion tons of waste per year, which is 10 times the global municipal waste. Or another data example, 453 violent conflicts between mining companies and communities were recorded worldwide in the period between 2002 and 2013. Those are some examples of the impact that these activities might have. So over the last 20 years, there has been a growing public and corporate awareness of these situations, which has led to the emergence of voluntary sustainability initiatives, which are market-led multi-stakeholder initiatives that aim at improvement and implement sustainability across the mining sector. So here we are with this brief introduction. I would like to open the dialogue with Matthew. And Matthew, why, in this context, given these remarks, why volunteer sustainability initiatives have emerged in the mining sector? Could you just explain us briefly and what for?
And thanks very much, Christina. So, well, I'm just to repeat some of the things that you've been mentioning, really, that mining clearly has a very high profile in the mining sector. So, sorry, in developing countries, but also worldwide, with massive positive impacts, potential social and social economic benefits, but also many potential negative social and environmental impacts, and they're very well known. There have been many reports on both of those, and a lot of effort trying to work out how to achieve those positive benefits and avoid those negative impacts at the same time. That's kind of the background, the context for looking at mining in a sustainable development context. Then over the last 20 or 30 years, there's been a lot of growth in voluntary sustainability initiatives in other sectors, looking at supply chains. So forestry, you mentioned that my involvement in this started with forestry, but looking at natural resources, marine, palm oil, agriculture, and moving in increasingly into mining and other hard commodities. And then we can look at the drivers for that, and now looking more specifically at mining. There are direct drivers and downstream drivers. The direct drivers, if you're looking at mining, the mining companies are under increasing scrutiny in terms of their performance. So their reputations are at risk. They're driven by wanting to maintain those reputations, but also by their social license to operate, their legal license to operate, so their permissions to explore, their permissions to exploit those resources, avoiding and maintaining their relationships with their workforces, and maintaining good relationships with communities, which can translate directly into the bottom line, preventing delays in production, blockades and such like. So all those are direct potential at least roles where voluntary standards could help mining companies meet some of those challenges. And then increasingly there are the downstream drivers, so the markets. I've certainly noticed the attention that's been paid to the likes of Apple and Microsoft, passing messages down their supply chains that they, or up their supply chains rather, that they really care about, and the car companies as well, they really care about the sourcing of their materials. And that message increasingly, I think, is reaching the mining companies, and that they know they need to address those concerns of their ultimate customers. And so that's a bit of background on that. And then in the mining sector in particular, and in the study we cover this in more detail, the sort of the history of development of efforts to develop standards and certification schemes that are applicable to mining. And we trace those back to the early 1990s, an initiative in Canada, the White Horse Initiative, through other efforts, mining, minerals and sustainable development, some work by MNSD, some work by WWF in Australia, the Mining Certification Evaluation Project, and then onwards to this review. So just growing interest, the profile of mining, the growth of these kinds of schemes in other sectors, the potential application to mining, partly driven by their own benefits and their own potential advantages, and then the downstream markets, and then these kinds of ideas being applicable to the sector. So Christina, back to you, or would you like me to continue?
Open another question. Okay, I am on mute. Yeah. Yeah. So so thank you, Matthew. So it's a multifactorial, multi-factors behind this emergence. So I mean, in the study that you have done, you have analyzed several volunteer sustainability initiatives. Could you please share with us some of the key findings?
Yes, of course. So could I get the next slide, please?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So first of all, to go into the background of the methodology. So IISD has developed its care methodology over many years now. And it's been applied to land-based agricultural production systems. It's been applied to marine systems. And so the context of this study is trying to use the same methodology and to apply it to these emerging systems in the mining sector. The CARE, it stands for coverage, assurance, responsiveness, and engagement. So different elements of these systems, and it very much looks at these standard systems as systems. So it's trying to go beyond just looking at the standard itself and trying to consider how those standards are embedded in an assurance system, and also looking at the aspects of governance, how they are designed, if you like, in terms of local applicability, and then the governance, how they governed, who's involved in their development, how they manage. So it goes beyond just the content of the standard. Just to give you some examples of that. So in the way that we've applied them, so on coverage, we're looking at the content of the standard. So that is the standard piece. One of the innovations from this application of the CARE methodology was we split that into two variables. One of them is looking at the breadth of coverage of the content, and also looking at the, if you like, how demanding the standard is. So how demanding are the requirements? But we wanted to go beyond just, if you like, high and low standards. It's very easy to slip into that high standards are good and less demanding standards are lower. We try to avoid that. We wanted to emphasize that there are different theories of change, different models that these systems have for affecting change. So we also looked at the degree of flexibility that the systems have. So whether those requirements are obligatory, whether they're conditional or flexible, or whether they're even optional. So we went beyond just the high, low level of requirements. Looking at assurance, there's a piece in the study about different chain of custody models that the systems have, but also what's their model for evaluating compliance. And again, there are different models that these systems can use. And we try to pull out those differences between the models. But we do there's an assumption in the report that third-party independent verification is the strongest model for evaluating compliance. So we have a scoring system in there, looking at the different models. And so, for example, the models would score highest if they are, or if sites are always subject to second or third party audit. That would get the maximum points for that particular indicator, or they might get in that particular indicator lower points if they're based on first party reporting only. So we're trying to look at the strength, the robustness of the assurance systems. Looking at the responsiveness, we're looking at elements like whether they're a continuous improvement model, are there incentives for improvement? Do they indicate different performance levels? So those are kind of examples of responsiveness indicators. Do they have, and then looking at engagement, we're looking at the governance. So are developing countries always represented on the board? How diverse are the stakeholders represented on the board? So that just gives you a flavour of the kinds of things we're looking at with the CARE methodology. And one thing just to emphasize is that the methodology is not trying to evaluate impact. It's trying to pull out the differences between these initiatives, the differences between the schemes, and trying to create some context so that readers can understand these differences and work out what those differences mean in terms of what they want from the schemes. That's just an introduction to the methodology. Can I have the next slide, please?
Yeah.
We started off with a very long list of schemes, and you'll see many reports about just the number of standards initiatives which are at least potentially applicable in the mining sector. We started off, we got a list of up to 150 different schemes. That, to my mind, somewhat exaggerates the number of schemes out there. We intentionally cast the net wide to begin with. So that very long list includes schemes which are systems which are only looking at a very narrow set of issues, or even one issue, so biodiversity, say, or water, or greenhouse gases, not necessarily focused on mining either. So a greenhouse gas scheme might be potentially applicable to mining, but it's not designed for mining. Some of the schemes we started on our initial list are not really standards, they're not really auditable. Some of them are old schemes. They existed 15 years ago, and they were initiatives, they produced their results, but they're not active, they're not live. Nonetheless, in the literature you will come across them, and so we wanted to look at them, note that they existed, but then they weren't part of our study. When we got into the study, we wanted to select the initiatives that take a broad approach to sustainability issues. So we wanted initiatives that cover a broad range of social issues, as well as a broad range of environmental issues. That was our starting point. We looked at initiatives focusing on large-scale industrial mining, as well as ASM, small-scale mining. And also we wanted to look at those which are applicable to quarrying or aggregates, which are not always included in these kinds of surveys. A few initiatives dropped out for various reasons, but we were left with this list of 15 standards that you can see in front of you. So those are the ones we looked at in more detail for the application of the CARE methodology. Can I have the next slide, please? Before jumping quickly into the findings, just to emphasize some of the challenges of the study, again, to emphasize that we recognized from the start that these initiatives, some of them have very different approaches. So they wouldn't all describe themselves as standards and certification schemes. Some of them don't do certification. Some of them would describe themselves as benchmarking schemes rather than standards. And we acknowledge that. And one of the challenges we had was, how do we compare apples and oranges? So, as the phrase goes. And we wanted to just say, well, we were exactly trying to say that in this space there are indeed apples and oranges, and here are some of their characteristics. So once again, to emphasize that we acknowledge these differences and we were interested to highlight those differences and explore them. Also, just to say that there really is no substitute for looking at the detail. We go into some detail with this analysis, but to present results, we are quite often averaging across a large number of indicators. For example, when we're looking at content, I think we're looking at 80 different indicators. We can split them into social, environmental, and sort of business ethics, if you like, indicators. We can average across those. We can subdivide again, but all the time whenever we consolidate, we're hiding the detail. If you go right down to the detail, you're losing the big picture. So we've tried to present the information. We have, in some cases, summarized it, but I would really encourage any readers, if they're really interested, to look at the detail before drawing any conclusions about what this means for them. Some of the initiatives still are, and certainly when we started the analysis, very new. Many of them were not fully operational when we started. Some of them became fully operational during the study. They're all evolving pretty rapidly. So again, this study is a snapshot in time. It's based on published information that was available up until September 2017. And many of the initiatives have gone on publishing new information since then, and that won't be included in this study. So it's a snapshot in time. And I think that reflects the rapid development in the sector. And even as we're doing the study, some initiatives are changing their approach, modifying their approach. So just a little health warning there that if you want to find out the latest information, you do need to go back to the website, the initiative's own websites. Next slide, please. I don't expect you to absorb this quickly. I just wanted to give you a flavor for the kind of information that's included in the report. So these are two figures from the report, 3.1 and 3.2, very high level, real summaries of a lot of data. And I really just wanted to say that I think it shows that one can pull out differences between these schemes. So on the left there, I mentioned earlier on that when we look at content, we looked at two variables. Along the x-axis there, we're considering, when we're looking at the standard, is the application of the standard obligatory at the far right of that scale, which would mean that here is the standard, however many requirements there are in it, then a mine site would have to meet all of those requirements to be recognized by that scheme. That would be on the far right of the left-hand figure. On the far left, you could have the same number of requirements potentially, but it could be completely optional. So a benchmarking scheme would tend to be on the left of that scale. Looking up and down on the y-axis, we look at content. So if you're at the top of that axis, it means that you're covering a broad range of requirements and you're covering them in more depth than the other schemes. If you're at the low end of that, the bottom of the y-axis, it means you're covering perhaps fewer issues and or you're covering them in less depth. And those two things are conflated. So you would need to look at the detail to see whether a scheme was, if you like, low down on the y-axis because it's got a narrow coverage, or because it might potentially have a broad coverage, but with a sort of a low level of detail. But really what that chart shows you is that when you look at the detail, these schemes are quite different. There's a range of approaches in there. And also just to mention that they could move. So the schemes that are on the far left, the far right of that diagram, if they introduced different levels into their standard, then they would start to move over to the left of that diagram without changing the content of the standard. They would just say, well, we now are introducing different levels. And that would show you a difference in their approach without changing the content of the standard. The diagram on the right there, all those bar charts, again, that shows a lot of data consolidated. So we're looking at a consolidated version of the assurance index, the responsiveness index, and the engagement index, and then an average of all three. You can see there are sort of three sections there. So the large scale industrial ones are on the left. The schemes that are applicable to ASM are on the, ASM are on the far right of that. And in the middle, you've got the quarrying and aggregate systems. And really just to mention, this is showing that there are differences between the schemes, and they're not necessarily correlated. So you can do, a scheme could do very strongly on assurance, if you like. It's got a very strong assurance system. It could be doing less well on responsiveness, or the other way around. Okay, so there's some diversity in there. I think that's all I would say in that, Sky. So go on to the next slide, please. So what are the findings? Very, very big picture findings, and just to give you a flavour. First of all, as I mentioned, there are a lot of initiatives, a lot of standards out there that you could potentially look at, and that is confusing. It causes some concern. However, when we look at the schemes that cover a broad range of issues, social and environmental issues, there are relatively few. So the ones we looked at, we found 15 that we covered, and that's covering large scale ASM as well as quarrying and aggregates. And within each of those categories, obviously fewer. And I think that you can navigate your way through this complexity, perhaps. It's not as daunting as one might think at first sight. And secondly, when you dig into it, there is some specialization. So when you look at the large scale initiatives, in the set we looked at, and there are, 6 or 7 in that set, one of those initiatives covers coal, so Better Coal looks at coal. Aluminium Stewardship Initiative, obviously aluminium, and the Responsible Jewellery Council is jewellery. There's little overlap in scope of the applicability of those initiatives. So if you're a coal miner, you do not need to look at the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative or the RJC, and vice versa. So there's overlap in terms of the issues, and there's certainly overlap in terms of their approaches to some of those issues, but not necessarily in terms of their scope of application. Having said that, there are real differences. So the previous slide, I would like to think, highlights that the schemes are different. They're not doing the same thing. Some of them are benchmarks, some of them are certification standards. Their theories of change are different. So when you look at them in a bit more detail again, they're not necessarily trying to do the same thing. So they're not duplicative in that way. They've got different initiatives with really different purposes. And then two observations which came out of interviews, and also even after the publication of the report, just from, I've got involvement in the sector, and I thought it was worth mentioning. One is that whilst historically there may not have been that much cooperation, I think there are definite signs over the last couple of years of increasing cooperation. And one of the key words of today is interoperability. I think there's real signs that the initiatives are beginning to work with each other, trying to reduce the level of confusion, if you like, the level of duplication, of overlap, trying to find ways of making it easier for users to navigate through the options. And finally, as an observation, we did some interviews for the work with a lot of initiatives, and we picked up from those an increasing demand. There seems to be increasing interest and increasing need for assurance, and I think that reflects increasing downstream interest as much as anything else. That was particularly looking at the large scale initiatives. So if you look at the next slide, please. looking at ASM, aggregates and quarrying, the other initiatives in the sample. Well, firstly, fair mind and fair trade. The analysis shows a huge level of similarity between those schemes, and that's not in the least bit surprising, because fair mind and fair trade were previously essentially integrated to organizations working together with the same standard. They have subsequently split, and you're beginning to see divergence in terms of their approach and their standards as a result of that. And then in aggregates and quarrying, I would say perhaps surprising diversity. There are within that group schemes which have a very different approach, but there are schemes in that group that appear to have a pretty similar approach, but quite diverse in terms of their standard, the way that their documentation and such like. And that did seem somewhat surprising. I think there's potential there for more convergence, to my mind. Mm-hmm. Next slide, please.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you very much, Matthew, for these highlights on the analysis that you conducted. I mean, we will be able to discuss further with you in the questions and answers, but I would like just to take up one idea that you mentioned, is like this analysis offers an open snapshot of the different initiatives for the reader and interest parties to understand this diversity and the different characteristics of each volunteer sustainability initiative and different theory of change. So I think it's, it prompts the interest of readers to go and read further about these initiatives. So thank you, Matthew. We will continue with you later on. So after this, this snapshot of these initiatives and the analysis, we would like to discuss briefly about Laura, because these volunteer sustainability initiatives are largely market-based approaches led by the private sector, as we have seen. So we would like to discuss with Laura whether the governments have a role with these volunteer sustainability initiatives, and if so, why, and how can public policy influence them? I mean, let's start this dialogue with Laura.
Yes, thanks very much, Christina. Yeah, and I think it can be interesting to just help maybe start with a little anecdote, and from a class that I was teaching the other day, where we had some master students and we gave them an exercise to design a public policy that dealt with a major environmental issue of their choice, and then they had to sort of discuss some of the challenges around implementing the public policy. So this group chose deforestation and the critically endangered species that were at risk due to palm oil production. So different sector, but sometimes we can learn from similar initiatives in different sectors. And so they decided that the public policy was Switzerland having a complete restriction on palm oil imports, except ones with certified responsible palm oil. So this is a hypothetical policy, of course, as most trade regimes would consider that kind of preferential access illegal. But anyhow, just to give the example, they went on about this. Then we asked them to say, okay, well, what would the challenges of this public policy be? And they immediately went to the challenges of associated with governing a voluntary sustainability initiative. So they were saying, oh, the assurance systems and how to verify, and how to be sure that you're reaching small producers as well as large scale producers. And it was interesting just for me to sort of bring them back and say, okay, as these are governance challenges, certainly, and sustainable governance challenges, but let's be clear about some of these distinctions. It has an influence, of course, on the effectiveness of a supposed restriction on palm oil, but it's from a different domain. And so let's get back to the public policy, which is your hypothetical restriction. So I think it just reflects how governance and sustainable development governance in particular has expanded to include, in most cases, public, private, civil society, international governance through UN agencies and others, and how these lines can be kind of blurry for people who are just learning about governance issues. So from that perspective, we did find it important in the background of the report to remind ourselves and our readers that VSIs are indeed instruments of the market, and that this is true even if governments are involved in some way or another through their initial in development or roundtables. But you know, when in doubt, these initiatives can be distinguished by the nature of the institutions that create, administer, and enforce them. So I think that point should be clear now. And with that said, what is the role of governments vis-a-vis these initiatives? And I think, of course, they create the entire regulatory framework in which VSIs operate. So I mean, what is their status as an organization? And the public sector is responsible for determining the different investment incentives in the mining sector at large. So the tax regime, the infrastructure available, et cetera. And all of this can influence the design of VSIs and their uptake. And I guess we gave one example in our report of how, you know, initiatives that are designed in a regulatory context of one country may cover those specific issues relative to one country, and when they try to apply it in different countries, it may or may not be transferred easily because the government policies and laws have shaped the very design of the initiative. So that kind of goes back to the drivers that Matthew was speaking about. Our research showed that both regulatory expansion and retraction can create demand for VSIs. So what do I mean by that is that new environmental laws and policies, so for example, a new type of environmental impact assessment, can create a market for VSIs, so meaning that an initiative can offer companies a way to show that they are compliant with the new law or policy. Another example of regulatory expansion would be, of course, the Dodd-Frank section of the financial regulations in 2010, and how that would leads for a demand for companies to show that they're compliant with the new rules, that companies using gold, tin, tungsten, tantalum are making efforts to know the country of origin and determining if they're supporting conflict funding in the DRC. So that was another example of regulatory expansion. For contraction, obviously, whatever the reason might be, it might be a political ideology, or it might be because of capacity or budget cuts. You know, whenever there's a retraction of policy, this can create a void that could be filled by voluntary initiatives and voluntary efforts. So beyond that, I mean, I don't think it's necessary, and I thought about it a little more, but just before joining the webinar, I don't think it's necessary that there's collaboration per se. There are two kind of parallel governance systems in most cases. But I would like to just propose to the webinar attendees today, especially those coming from public sector, is it a wasted opportunity not to take a closer look at the initiatives that are perhaps operating within your borders, or that companies registered in your country are undertaking? And I'd just like to suggest that maybe it could be an interesting mapping to see, okay, well, what are VSIs in the mining sector offering within our country, and what does that mean? What do they cover? So, Matthew's talking about the different types of content they cover. What are the types of mines that they're applying to, that they are relevant for? And that this can be and it may be an interesting exercise to see certainly what VSIs are there, but also maybe questioning, why are they there? Are they in place because, oh yeah, in the 80s we rolled back on X or Y, or are they in place because they are, helping essentially to show compliance with our own regulatory body of texts and documents and laws and policies? So it was just a reflection for the audience. Christina, and I'd be happy to pass to the next question.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. I think we will be able to discuss further on this with the audience, and vice versa. What would be the role that VSIs might have to support public policy?
Thank you. I'll go quickly. So I'm just going to make these 3 points. That one, I mentioned maybe more in the previous intervention, is that they can help identify targets. So obviously implementing sustainable development is challenging for all and every government. So perhaps using the existence and type of VSIs as an indicator for key target areas. So we have one example in the report from Sierra Leone where an official shared with us that the presence of the Diamond Development Initiative in this case, helped them to identify artisanal and small-scale mines as a priority, specifically the need to integrate them into the formal economy and build compliance with the legal frameworks. Secondly, broadening support and evidence for progressive policy intervention. So this can touch a couple of elements, but to mention briefly that certainly voluntary initiatives may have a wealth of data on different social, environmental, economic factors that could be of interest to the public sector. They might promote a culture of participation and collaboration, and perhaps be modeling inclusive processes that the government is aspiring to. And also they can be providing training to government officials as well. And then thirdly, inspiring new public policy and regulation. So sometimes, and there are examples of when a voluntary sustainability initiative becomes endorsed, either being incorporated into laws and policies, or perhaps model laws, model contracts within a country at the national or subnational level. Or through public procurement, for example. Yeah, one example we have here is that the due diligence guidance for responsible supply chains of minerals from conflict-affected and high-risk areas from the OECD, which most of you will be familiar with. In 2021, the EU conflict mineral legislation will essentially enshrine them. And so happy to discuss that more later. So that's all for now.
Yeah. Okay, Laura, maybe you can brief us a bit about what are the challenges that you identified that a public sector might have in using volunteer sustainability initiatives to meet their development goals. What have you found on this at this front?
I think it mirrors the challenges that Matthew has already spoken to more broadly, in the sense that the challenges can be related to essentially keeping track of the number of initiatives, the diversity, and we've already discussed there's diverse for good reasons. I think another thing is that they're not a panacea. I mean, they're part of a governance world where there can often be nice shiny reports and logos, but they have their own array of issues related to implementation and verification and the success of their impact, which again is not something we studied in this report. But I'd say for governments to be, yeah, I think that's something to be wary about, is not turning to this parallel governance world as a panacea. And maybe briefly to mention that there are, of course, problems of unintended consequences and perverse incentives. Same challenge applies, of course, to public sector laws and policies, but they're not immune to it in the VSI world. And finally, on my last point, I have a slightly more pessimistic spin than Matthew, but I say here that they have in many cases been slow and sometimes reluctant to collaborate with one another. And if the goal is really the greater good and a more sustainable world, if we're going to leave it at that scale, then we need to really see more genuine efforts to work together and recognize and make these more interoperable.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Well, thank you very much, Laura, for enlightening us this potential opportunity as well as existing challenges for both, public sector and these market-based initiatives to potentially collaborate. I think you have opened the floor for a dialogue with the participants and for questions. Before moving to the Q&A, I would like to just to briefly talk about the key takeaways of these presentations from Matthew and Laura. First is that we have a large and diverse number of volunteer sustainability initiatives, different design, levels of application, traceability, target outcomes, and we are all invited to dig further about them in the report. I think it's really important to understand that the care analysis illustrates this particularity, but it's not a tool to assess the impact or the success of these initiatives on the ground. I think that, as we have seen, there is a large number of initiatives, but there is some positive signs of interoperability between them. And I will also recall, Lara's point, there is an opportunity for public sector to use volunteer sustainability initiatives as tools to meet their public development goals. So those are some of the few key takeaways from this presentation. So we have 15 minutes to move to the questions and answer section. So I have already 4 here. So I will read them and address to Matthew and Lara accordingly. So we have one from Andres. Okay, volunteer sustainability initiatives in mining sector is a response to obtain social licenses to operate, and it should be part of project management plan. How do you factor the cost of implementing volunteer sustainability initiatives for large, medium, and small mining companies? It's a really operational question. Matthew, can you go for it, please?
Sure, yes. And it goes beyond, if you like, the scope of the report specifically. So this isn't something the report covers. But in general, I mean, it's a good question, of course. I would say you need to think about the cost of implementing the standard, which is a part of, if you like, the cost of meeting the requirements of the scheme, and then separately the cost of it's an independent certification scheme, the certification cost. Those are 2 quite different costs. If you look at the cost of implementing the standard, then to the extent, these are voluntary schemes, voluntary standards initiatives. So different companies will come to their own judgment about what's the cost of implementation compared to the benefits of implementation. Some of the requirements are likely to be legal requirements. So the company would actually be legally required to meet them anyway. And then the additional cost and additional potential benefit is having been the independent assurance that those standards have been met. If the standards are going above and beyond the law, if you like, they're higher than the legal minimum, then companies will make their own judgments. So if you lose the social license to operate, then that has massive costs. So in a way, you're taking out an insurance scheme against other things. If you lose subsequently the legal license to operate, again, massive costs. Delays, you have communities, workers blockading sites. The interruption to your business is a massive cost. So those kinds of things are, companies all the time are making judgments about which standards they meet and are there benefits justified by the costs. And then there's the downstream pressure, which I mentioned. So to the extent that the ultimate customers are making these inquiries, companies can decide if it's worth their while to demonstrate that they do indeed meet the standards which their ultimate customers are beginning to ask for. The large, medium, small piece, yes, I think the nature of standards and certification tends to be, and there are economies of scale. The larger companies find it easier to absorb some of those. So many of these standards have more stringent standards applicable to larger companies. So I suppose you could say that their costs are higher also. The ASM piece, I think, is quite complex because, as I'm sure many of the people on this webinar know very well, ASM is a very different, or certainly the artisanal side of it is a very different model to the large scale mining. And the schemes which are applicable to artisanal miners, the fair trade and the fair mine, they have quite a different approach. And both of those schemes build in premium payments for participants, at least in part as a way of mitigating against some of those costs of implementation. At least that's my understanding. I hope that's helpful. I mean, and actually, it's a general. It goes beyond the scope of this study, but I hope that's a helpful observation.
Very good. Thank you, Matthew. Another question from Alvin. Okay, to what extent does this study include aspects of human rights, due diligence, especially related to exposure of humans and workers to toxic and otherwise hazardous substance? I think, Matthew, it's for you, I guess.
So I'm just flipping myself off mute. I'm flipping through the the elements of the standard that are applicable. So human rights and exposure to toxic and hazardous substances. Well, there's a section, there's a section, a sub-index on exactly waste and hazardous substances. So we were looking at waste disposal, management of hazardous substances, a specific look at mercury, a look at cyanide, and air emissions and dust. So there are in the standard there are in the content, the C part of the care analysis, there's a range of issues there which are assessed. And when we assess, I would say it's a fairly crude assessment. So we're looking at all these schemes and saying, does their standard include something that addresses those issues? And then we say, does it sort of, we define kind of an example definition. So just to take cyanide, the standard, the example of our indicator is the standard specifies criteria for the safe use and management of cyanide, if relevant, in line with the requirements of the cyanide code. And then we score it as a 0 if there's no mention of cyanide, to the extent it's relevant, a 2 if the answer is yes, it does pretty much everything you would want, and a 1 if it touches on the issue, but not to the level that we're looking for. Okay, so yes, we certainly look at those kinds of issues. And on the human rights one, I'm just scanning through to see, I mean, we cover labour rights, the kind of the ILO, labour rights, employment benefits. And yes, under human rights, it's based on the earlier applications of the care methodology. So we look at access to education, access to medical care, housing and sanitary facilities, human rights impact assessment. Those are the specific human rights ones, as well as workers' health and safety.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very good. Thank you, Matthew. I have a question here from Olivier. What did you find out about the geographical scale used by the volunteer sustainability initiatives? Is this criteria defined? Which landscape unit seems to be successful? So I think it's more a question regarding landscape approach in the initiatives analyzed. Matthew, I think it's also for you.
I'm getting all the questions. Someone asked a question for Laura.
Go for it. I'm enjoying.
I don't think that the geographical scale, no, that's not something we looked at. I think it's a working assumption that these systems, the standards, are applicable to sort of the mine site level, given that there's some ambiguity in a way about what's a mine site. But no, the study didn't consider, if you like, landscape level initiatives. Some of the requirements certainly are applicable outside the, if you like, the fence of the site. So the relationship of the mine with neighbouring communities, for example, would certainly be covered by some of the indicators. But we didn't look at landscape level approaches in this study.
Mm-hmm. Okay, for future ones probably. And I have a final question here from David. Palm oil was mentioned earlier. Is there any perspective on how the mining related VSIs compare to those of other industries? I think Matthew, you are the one.
Yeah, I mean, no. This wasn't a sort of a cross-sectoral study, but it was intentional that we use the care structure, and so the indicators that we used, I didn't mention where those indicators came from. We started off with the same care indicators as have been used for studies of VSIs applicable to land use. And I believe, I don't know if anyone on the call would know, I believe that RSPO, the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, was included in one of those earlier studies. And part of the intent of using the care methodology is that whilst there are modifications to what we look at, of course, how do you apply the same standards to mining as opposed to land use, as well as to marine systems, the intent is that the studies should provide some level of comparability. But we didn't, do that kind of cross-sectoral assessment in this study. but there's other IISD reports. The one on land use is available. You can download it on the internet, and you could certainly see how they, at least at some level of detail, how they compare.
Yeah, I think I may want to add that the SSI report in 2014, I think, on the green economy, I think it analyzed a bit more RSPO. Okay, so you can you can access this report online.
Okay.
I have other questions. Okay, from Malet. Okay. Maybe Lara, can you take this one? What would be the perspective on the future of volunteer sustainability initiatives? Do you see a continued rise or tapering of the consolidation of standards? So do we see a rise in the number of standards or a consolidation of standards coming in? Laura, maybe you can answer this one.
Well, I do think Matthew is better positioned to answer. However, I'll just kind of repeat what the study found in the sense that we looked at, and it does seem that in large scale mining, there seems to be, we have kind of a modest enthusiasm or modest hope that indeed maybe the number of new initiatives being developed is slowing, and that the number of kind of efforts or forums to collaborate are growing, which didn't seem to be the case in the other sort of subsectors we looked at. But I must admit, I mean, being based in Geneva, just as a personal point, I mean, I often hear, I won't make any specific names at the moment, but I do hear about, oh, you know, we'll come up with a code of conduct for best practice in X in the mining sector. Oh, we'll come up with a code of conduct in Y. And my kind of knee-jerk reaction, certainly since this research, is take a good look at what exists and how to complement and how to help implement and how to support and improve what exists already.
Very good, Laura. I think I have a question along these lines from Nadine that you can also answer. I mean, she would like to know, you know, why maybe these initiatives are not collaborating, you know, strongly. Is it an issue of time, financing? They don't have resources? I mean, what should be an approach to encourage collaboration?
Let me have a go at that one. And Laura and I, as we've been working on this work together, and Laura mentioned, I'm more optimistic about the future of collaboration already. I mean, there's certainly, and collaboration is difficult, first of all, and there's some quite good work. So ICEAL has done some work on, fairly recently, on how do you go about collaborating, what are the best approaches to collaboration, and looking specifically at the mining, what they call the mining, minerals and metals sector. It's difficult. It does take resources, it takes time. You know, you need to start by building up trust, trust between your stakeholders, your boards. You're expanding. I mentioned that there are some of these schemes focus on particular commodities like, you know, coal or jewellery or aluminium, and I'm involved in one for steel. There are natural groupings of stakeholders for each of those initiatives, and when you broaden the scope, you're bringing in more and diverse opinions, so it becomes harder to just have the discussion, just to hold the forum. So there are good reasons why it's challenging. I do think, though, that there are good signs of collaboration, and I'm involved in several of those collaborations myself. They're fairly early days, and I think they start by recognizing the challenge, but then starting slowly. You build relationships, and then gradually you look at, well, where can we work together? Can we share our work on assurance, say? Can we share training on this? Could we give a common message to downstream customers? So yeah, and like I said, I'm optimistic that that's the way things will go. Just to jump at the earlier question though about increasing numbers, certainly there are new metals coming in with new schemes, and I would really just echo Laura's advice to some of those new initiatives. If the starting point is not, you know, we're a new metal, gosh, we need our new scheme, but we're a new group of stakeholders, what can we use that already exists? Could we use wholesale some of the approaches that these other schemes have developed? then I think the chance of sort of harmonization in the future would be much greater.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Matthew. I mean, we're going to go another 10 more minutes because we have other questions coming in. So, you know, for those who can stay, we're going to spend 10 more minutes. So we have a question from Titus. How should we view volunteer sustainability initiatives in light of national development agenda, especially with respect to S&M and the formalization of the sector? I think, Matthew, probably that's for you or Laura, either both of you.
I think I'll hand that on to Laura.
Okay, I mean, yeah, if you want to say something on the formalization of ASM, Matthew, but I think more generally, I mean, I think we can view VSIs as allies in broad terms to move towards a more socially, environmentally robust mining sector and see them as development partners, and especially where it aligns with the public policy goals. And so that kind of goes back to this mapping exercise that I spoke about and what could be the potential value of that. And I mean, you know, IISD has a position that certainly a combination of public and market-based tools are needed to tackle, you know, these enormous sustainable development issues as reflected in the SDGs. And maybe also just to say, I mean, perhaps for the public sector also to understand that this demand, this consumer demand to know more about the origin of their products and the processes to make them, you know, this touches, you know, branding and reputation of public sector as well, and where it's good to do business and where companies can be comfortable establishing business for the long term. So just to also maybe think of this growing consumer demand as a driver as well for the robustness that we need in the regulatory space, the public regulatory space, that is.
Mm-hmm. Very good. And another question along these lines for you, Laura. Whether Laura is familiar with an example of public policy that links mining activity with the management of water, for instance, in terms of water use or water pollution. Are you aware? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, a specific example is not coming to mind, although you could certainly imagine through, well, obviously through hard kind of command and control regulations that the government already has in place on water standards. So, you know, that VSIs can demonstrate that they're compliant with water quality and with tailings standards. And beyond that, you know, the public sector could have performance contracts for infrastructure development around mines, where, you know, water needs to be used efficiently, for example, and the acceptable even drinking water supply for the people working on mines. So this could come through procurement contracts as well, and having robust water quality standards or water efficiency standards, for one example. There are many more.
And in the VSI area, I believe that the Alliance for Water Stewardship has done some work
also,
in mining companies. So I'm not 100% sure of that, but Sarah or Sarah, you might look at the Alliance for Water Stewardship website or contact them to see if they have worked with mining companies, see if that's correct.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Excellent. Very good. Let's take the last two questions from Joshua to Laura. Laura said preferential trade policy based on sustainability defined by volunteer sustainability initiatives would be illegal. But there are policies like EU Renewable Energy Directive that do just this, exclude less sustainable import based on private standards. Can Laura explain more of the logic of why governments setting sustainability criteria in trade policy is not okay, or under what conditions this would be okay?
Yeah, no, I think I was setting myself up for that. No, it's a good point. I think what I mean is that what would be okay, again, what would be acceptable is the standard itself. So the actual technical specification of production, for example. So the acceptable level of an emission or of a pollution measure of one sort or another, to give a straightforward example. That is embodied by the standard or the label. That standard can indeed become integrated into regulatory policy. What couldn't be, or in public procurement in any case, which is a domain I know well, the kind of the VSI itself could not be. So it would need to, the text of the actual law or policy needs to be this standard or equivalent, meaning the content of this standard or label or equivalent. And I hope that's clear, because then of course the voluntary sustainability initiative can go off and change its content. And so what matters is that that they specify the technical parts of that label that they're aiming to support.
Okay, good. And let's take the last question, but not least, from Cameroon, Emmanuel. Okay, he is working in with the ACM. So, and he would like to know whether the CARE methodology addressed the issue of local content and local procurement. I think, Matthew, you can end with this question.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I was just looking at that, and I think this is looking at the question is related to whether the standard would require companies to purchase locally. I understand. Just just in case it's not the case, that the responsiveness part of the CARE analysis does look at, if you like, the local applicability of the standard, whether it's modified to take account of local conditions. But I don't think that's what you're asking, Emmanuel. Whether the average part covers sort of requirements for local procurement. There's one element which relates to, if you like, having relationships between, which is specifically to ASM, whether the standard specifies criteria for setting up contracts with traders, but that's looking at, if you like, the formalization of downstream purchasing rather than local purchasing by the miners, if you like. So that may be part of what your question is about. But in terms of, does the standard, does the CARE analysis have an assessment, if you like, of requirements for local procurement? No, I don't think it does. I'm slightly hesitant because I haven't looked at that for a while, but I don't think that's the case.
I may add that, Emmanuel, maybe the right way to look at it is go to the publication and the indicators. There might be some indicators that might be related to local content, you know, like local suppliers and so forth. But in the list of indicators, you may be able to go through and find your answer there. Okay, very good. Well, thank you.
Actually, sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt. I was just scanning through it. There is an indicator on local hiring. So one of the indicators was that the standard includes criteria promoting preference policies for local hiring and purchasing that contributes to the economic development of local communities. So there is an indicator on that. But and it's quite a nice example, actually, of, you know, the need to look into detail. You know, if it's a specific question that you're interested in, then you need to go into the detail, because, you know, that wouldn't be something that is highlighted at the general level by the report.
Yeah.
And also just to add that the IGF did also very recently publish a dedicated report to this topic on local content. So you would find that report on the IGF website by Erin Cosby.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, very good. Well, I think it's time to leave. Thank you so much, Laura and Matthew, for being with us today, for sharing your learnings, experience, and engaging with our participants. Thank you, participants, for your questions, your listening, and please, this webinar has been recorded, so it can be accessible in our website, and you can always reach us to our generic email, which you can see now in the screen. So thank you all, and let's engage in some other time. Take care.